All right, welcome to the 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 people that are watching this live. Doing this live to answer some questions, any questions you might have for me for Montana hunting any of the species out here, or any questions you have, doing some shed hunting. Mostly I'm trying out some features to work on the podcast with Dan. So if you've got anything, let me know. Also, new today, trying out a feature specifically. There's a link in the chat. If you click that link, it's going to put you into a queue. You can click join with camera, and then you can actually join me on the stream. This is the first time I'm using it, so be patient. When you get into that queue, it's going to take me a second to transfer you into the room. So be willing to give that a try. So we'll see if anybody joins the queue and jumps on. Justin Tanner's in. Justin, what's going on? Again, if anybody wants to join, check the chat. There's a link, video.ninja. Click that link. It'll put you into a queue. You can do it from a smartphone, I believe, or a computer with a webcam. You'll be able to join the stream, and then I'll get you into the room. So any questions in the meantime? I got Steve Huffman says, are you doing any hunts with Dan next season? I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure what Dan's got planned for the public land challenge or what I'm going to be doing exactly. Normally, every year I get a deer, elk, and a bear tag in Montana. So I'll be doing those. And then I usually like to travel to one, sometimes two states. Last year I had a Kansas tag and a North Dakota tag, and did terrible in both of those states, but probably hit up another state this year. Up north outdoors says Jeremy. I believe I've heard you say you're originally from Michigan. If I have that right, where at in Michigan? What was your hunting experience here? So yeah, originally from Michigan. I grew up in Aranet County. Lived in both Standish and Sterling predominantly. My hunting experience in Michigan is that there's a lot of deer, but not a lot of trophy deer. So I always tell people Michigan's a great state for opportunity. If you want to go and just get any deer, a doe, a spike, a year, sometimes 2-year-old buck. Hard to beat Michigan for numbers. Tons of deer in Michigan. And it was a good place to learn to become a better hunter because there are fewer mature deer. So you really have to put in the work and get into some hard to access places if you want to ferret out a good deer in Michigan. And a lot of times the reality is there's just not one on the property you have access to. And that was maybe another thing. Decent amount of public land, but it's hard to get on private in Michigan because so many people hunting culture is big. Gemini Ridge Outdoors. You don't want to sunbathe in Kansas again this year. Yeah, so Gemini Ridge, I run into that fellow, Jesse Kurzanowski. He was actually on my podcast. I forget which episode, but I ran into Jesse while hunting Kansas. He was out there again this year, and I think that was part of the reason I struggled in Kansas this year. The week that I was there, it was mostly 60s and 70s. So that shut down a lot of the rut activity. And something else I noticed in Kansas this year is some of the areas that I hunt, the crop rotation was different. So I've been drawn every other year. I was there 16, 18, 20, and 22. 23 is the first year that I was able to draw back to back. I don't know. I've got bad luck in Kansas. Some guys seem to draw every year. But, anyways, a lot of the areas that I hunt were corn or other green fields. This year were beans. The beans were picked, and there was not very much doe activity on some of the properties that have been good to me in the past. So learned that. Somebody click this link for me. The link's in the chat. That video ninja link. Scroll up a little bit. See if I can get somebody in the queue. Haven't seen anybody. Brave souls, where are you at? James Roby says, are you going to continue the channel but just stop doing the podcast? Yeah, James, that's the plan. Maybe we'll see. We'll see how the live stuff does. I might do some lives for a while. If there's overwhelming demand for the podcast, I'll probably come back to doing it. But I explained it in the video I put out. The big reason why I stopped doing the podcast is it's a lot of work, and maybe that's not a great reason, right? But I've been doing it for 2.5, 3 years now, and my viewership hasn't really picked up that much. I think the people that were watching it really liked it, but I haven't been able to grow that much. And by the time I get set up for a podcast, I usually write an outline think that's part of the reason a lot of people were enjoying my podcast is that I try to be well prepared. So by the time I write an outline, research the guest, contact the guest, right? Just maybe that's something people don't think about. You've got to reach out to people, schedule. That can be a hassle sometimes. So write an outline, schedule, actually record it, and then I try to have a quality product. So I usually did some editing after the fact. Then you've got to render the video or the audio and upload it to these podcast platforms. That's a long explanation to say that probably on the low end, if you're listening to an hour podcast, it probably took me 5 or 6 hours for start to finish to put that product out. And when I was first starting, that was probably closer to 8. So a lot of work goes into those. And the audience, initially, I knew I wouldn't have much of an audience. I was hoping that would grow over time, and it didn't happen, or it didn't happen to the extent or at the speed which I thought it would. And there's just so many other podcasts out there, and there's a lot of good ones too. So for now, I think I'm going to hang that up. But yes, I do still plan to do hunting videos, I like doing product reviews, and I'm glad to jump on, do some stuff like this, do live Q&A and get people that are interested in my channel chance to ask questions or come on. So that'd be cool. I'll see. James says, I was a big fan of the podcast, very organized, great interviewing. I like hearing you on the Beast podcast and streams, though. Yeah, and that's a good outlet for me for now. I like doing that too. It's got a bigger audience, obviously, there. Dan has a lot easier time because he's got a name getting people on, like Barry Wenzel. If you guys have been following the Beast, Barry Wenzel was on the Beast Report a couple weeks ago, and then Bob Folkrod. Those guys are big names, obviously, in hunting. Some of the legends. Those are the type of people that I wouldn't have a chance to get on my podcast because I don't have the audience or the name recognition. So it's a lot easier to facilitate that on Dan's channel where he's got that audience. No one's clicked the link yet. Don't be shy. I'm going to post it again. So while we're waiting for that, I don't know if you guys are doing any shed hunting. I went out shed hunting over the weekend for the first time this year and did find a match set of whitetail shed. So I think they're starting to shed in Montana, at least. I know it varies throughout the Midwest, but some of the deer are definitely down, and I've been seeing the shed hunting stuff pick up more and more on social media. So we got any shed hunters in the chat? Gemini Ridge says, "What's your favorite tag hunt in Montana?" That's a good question. Came as a surprise to me, but I've really grown to love antelope hunting, and for a couple of reasons. So, one, never got to hunt antelope in Michigan. Not a whole lot of them there, zero as far as I know. And it's a real challenging bow hunt, and I like to spot and stalk them. My favorite thing about antelope, though, is it's all day action. So antelope are just a very visible. They live in the plains. They're not hiding in a cattail swamp or deep in some draw in a mountain like an elk, and they aren't active just at dusk and dawn like deer and elk are. You'll see deer obviously during the rut all day, but antelope you can sleep in and then you can go out 9, 10 o'clock, spot an antelope, put a stalk on it. A lot of times with a bow, that usually only lasts 10, 20 minutes because they see so good they bust you, and then your stock's over, and then you drive around for 20 minutes, you find another buck, put another stock on. So if you like action and you don't mind failing, antelope bow hunting is great. And another thing that I like, if you get the bow only antelope tag in Montana, it actually starts August 15th. So you get a super early season that's open before the deer elk seasons, which open the first Saturday in September. And it's a great way to tune up your stalking. So if you're rusty, coming out of the summer, you haven't hunted since last November, December, you get that antelope bow tag, get out there, and they're a really, really hard animal to stalk. So it gets you back in the hunting mindset. And then by the time the deer elk season opens, I feel like I'm real sharp and my stalking game is on point. Up north, outdoors says, I've been scouting, but no sheds found. Too much snow here still. Oh, we gotta take her on the link. So let me try to do this and see if it works. There's Mr. Skleaner. Can you hear me? All right. I gotta transfer you to the stream, so one second. I can hear you, though. I can hear you good. Holy cow, now you're on the stream. What's going on, Jacob?
I know. Not much, man. I was actually just about to crawl into bed. I'm kind of a like cash in pretty late, wake up pretty early kind of guy.
Yeah, so I'm trying a new feature out, which you are the first one. So I appreciate you being the
Nice.
guinea pig. And
Yeah.
for people that want to know how this works now is if you click that link, it's going to put you into a queue, just like it would like if you were calling customer service. And then I can bring on people one at a time. So if you'd like to come on and ask some questions or just BS, click that link. It'll put you in the queue. I'll talk to Jacob here for a couple minutes, and if anyone has questions for Jacob, drop those in the chat too. So
Awesome,
what's new
man.
with you while I got you on?
Um, really, I mean, there's some things that I'm working on right now. You might be able to tell from the new podcasting gear. But officially not really releasing too much information about that quite yet.
Teaser. I
But
like.
trying to get together. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I said teaser. I like it.
I know, I know. I'm trying to figure out my skin in that kind of game, and just a lot of scouting, stuff like that, getting out any chance I can. Um, Big thing this off season for me is spending time with family and friends and the people that I may have not been able to spend as much time with during season. Uh, Obviously, doing a lot of scouting and hunting, so it's good to prioritize them now while I can for the most part, and make them feel like I love them as much as possible.
Yeah, that's a good thing to catch up on the honey-do list. And if you fell off on the relationship, good time to repair it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, everything. I'm very blessed to have a girl that absolutely loves taking part in my passions. She doesn't hunt herself, but she absolutely supports everything about me and my passions. So it's nice that we're always on the incline so far. We'll see how that goes continuing on, but
Yeah, that's awesome. Jacob, I don't know on your end, you might not be able to see unless you're on the browser, the YouTube
Mhm.
chat, but I've got some questions
Oh,
here.
okay.
So Jesse Miller said,
Great.
just for clarification, last week someone said you have to be at your truck at the end of legal in South Carolina. That was on Dan's show. So that's not true. We
Mhm.
can hunt shoot until 1 hour after sunset. Yeah, that's interesting. Someone
Oh,
on
interesting.
Dan's show last week, we were talking about weird game laws, and someone said you had to be back at your truck at the end of legal, which meant like if you're hunting in a swamp, you might have to leave an hour before the end of legal time to get back. So, but apparently that's not
Wow.
true.
Yeah, I don't think that would be possible for many of my accesses. I could sprint the whole way out, and I don't think I'd make it back in an hour.
Yeah. We were talking a little bit before you jumped on, Jacob, about shed hunting. I know you found a couple sheds. So someone asking me, Justin Tanner said, what's my approach to shed hunting, Jeremy? I'll give you a quick one and then let's hear from you, Jacob. My
Sure.
approach is a lot like hunting, miles for piles, as everybody says. So get out there and walk. But to elaborate on that, a lot of times in Montana, just like most northern states, animals kind of yard up into wintering areas. So if I get into an area that I've never been, I'm looking to find sign, fresh tracks, fresh poop, and it's usually pretty easy because there's some snow or the ground's soft in the spring. If I'm not seeing that stuff, I usually don't spend too much time there. If I am seeing that stuff for whitetails, obviously in Montana, that means you're along water, creeks, rivers. You got to have water around for the whitetails, and then south facing anything is good. And same thing for mule deer, but not as much water. I've found the most, like a disproportionate amount of my mule deer sheds on draws that have south and east exposure. So obviously in the winter, you get a lot of west winds, a lot of north winds. So those southeast, they got exposure to the sun, and then they're protected from the wind. So I found mule deer sheds all over, but I don't know, 40% of them, maybe a really high number in southeast facing slopes. What about you, Jacob?
Yeah, that's interesting too, because when we were in Nebraska in the early season, we were looking for northwest facing slopes when we wanted any kind of shade. So that's and there was a high correlation between betting on that side in the very, very hot, arid early season and and where we were finding them. And honestly, I see a lot of the similar things to you. My hill country approach, I mean, everywhere is just miles for piles.
Right.
Um, My hill country approach, which is what I have the most experience with, is walking like crazy. Usually I'm scouting more than I'm shed hunting. But sometimes I like to reserve the last 30 minutes, right before sundown. Um, Sometimes during that sunset, the white is kind of glistening, poking out a little more. I'll just like to have fun during that 30 minutes, and I'll go looking for sheds. And I bobble between two approaches. One of them is just more opportunistic, like areas where sheds stick out, like shorter grass and things like that. Sometimes it's much easier to pick a shed out of that rather than an area with maybe some snow or a bit of leaves covering and stuff like that. But when I'm really looking for sheds and sheds alone, I like to go on those south facing slopes, and I really like areas that have very thick cover from a deer's perspective. Stuff that kind of gives them at times a bit of thermal cover, but I really like briar patches and things like that, where they have exposure to the sun from above, but enough cover when all those leaves are off that they feel comfortable and hidden where they're at, where they're bedded down. I like to tell my friends, like, you could see them easily from above, but you couldn't see them 5 yards away if you're on the ground. That's where I find a lot of the sheds, typically around bedding in those areas, and then a huge correlation with honey locust pods in the hills in Southwest Wisconsin, at least. Just those late season food sources tend to really draw them in. And then in marshes, it's just absolutely freaking miles. Depends if there's ice on. Like right now, there's just a little bit of ice on, and I'm getting pictures of bucks deep into little isolated patches of risen cover with dropped antlers right now. But other than that, they're kind of a little bit closer to food sources where, normally during the season they're bedded way out in those marshes. But if there was pretty much no ice left and no snow for them to have traction on that ice out in those marshes, I'm expecting to find them a lot closer to actual land.
No, all good points. And that's the thing, just like hunting, right? The deer aren't in the same spot every year. The sheds aren't in the same spots every year. I've had a few spots that have been pretty predictable that are good winter type cover. And I'm not gonna lie, in Montana, shed hunting is just way easier. So coming from Michigan, which like you've experienced, Jacob, in the swamps where you're getting, cattails, it's so hard to find them in there. In a lot of the spots I'm hunting in Montana or shed hunting in Montana are prairie habitat. So there's sage and stuff, but it's way more open. There's not nearly the amount of rodents. So I've found sheds that are 3-4 years old that haven't been chewed on at
Oh,
all. And if they've aged a year, they're usually bleached white. So you find white out on brown landscape. It's pretty easy compared to a pretty brown antler and cattails, right? Like night and day difference trying to look for them. So it's not the same game out here. It's definitely easier.
it's funny that you mentioned the antlers not being in the same place every year, because I see this, and basically we had our scout workshops this weekend with Dan,
Yeah.
and I was there, and last year I had found a really nice 5-point side on one of the remote areas that we go and scout as a group, and everyone's kind of like itching to get to that spot. And it's funny because Dan leads them to the bedding and leads them to those areas, and you see a lot of guys looking over to the side and walking over to the side and trying to get out in front, going to where I found that shed. And it's just hilarious because it's like I made a point when we were out there, is like, how many of you guys like recognize this area from a video and went within a 5-foot circle of where I found that shed? And we see guy after guy do it after just 1 year of one shed being found. Like,
Crazy.
it's amazing how that recency bias influences people, and how just a little bit of success and that confirmation makes you super partial to information. So like, that's one shed that one guy saw in a video at some point. Imagine what people do naturally in their subconscious when they get a kill. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as you're shed hunting. Like, you have plenty of areas that you've had success, and conditions change. Like I just talked about, we have years that the thaw happens earlier, years that the ice stay on more. Food sources change all the time.
Yeah, I was gonna say
And
crop rotation is a huge one because if you've got a standing cornfield, you can bet every deer for 3 or 4 miles is on that. And next year, if that's something else, it's picked beans or whatever, like that's not the draw, or leftover red acorns, red oaks, whatever.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's just, I think it's really important for people to keep in mind the biases they're finding when they're shed hunting. If they're relating to maybe where they already hunted during the year to try and find sheds, and just kind of going in there with true observation and relating that to how they approach their hunting season, and just kind of learning as you go as well.
Yeah, and I don't think there's like a crazy amount of information that can be taken away from finding a set of sheds. The biggest one is
Mhm.
that deer is still alive right now. And
Yep.
I did a podcast early on with Dwayne Diefenbach. He's the research biologist at Penn State. And so this is
Mhm.
going to be specific to Pennsylvania, but it's a pretty good representation of the Midwest. He said that the mortality rate for adult deer that survive the hunting season is like 2 or 3%. It's really low. And of that 2 or 3%, like I forget, I'd have to go back and listen to it. Maybe he didn't say, but a high number of it was like car deer accidents. It wasn't even predation
Oh,
from coyotes or anything. So basically, if you find sheds, there's a very, very, very good chance that deer is alive. And then the other
mhm.
thing is, if conditions are similar next year, we talked about all the things we just talked about, food sources and stuff, then you have got an idea where that deer might end up in late season. So it tells you a few things. It's definitely not the whole puzzle, though.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. There's plenty of people that get wrapped up in the same ways, but I think the ones that find consistent success are always just looking for an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, exactly. For else is, do y'all have any experience hunting blowdown areas? How about you?
Um, I guess it depends on what he's asking there, because I've seen places when I've done hiking trips and stuff out west where it's like avalanche blowdown areas where it's just tree after tree after tree. I do not have experience hunting something like that, but I have experience in hill country hunting drainages that it seems like at some point every single log at the top and edges of those drainages has fallen into it. I use blowdowns to my advantage as kind of an obstacle. So if I have like a really, really light wind, like a let's say four, maybe six and under mile-an-hour wind, I'll position my trees such that my wind is blowing into a blowdown that I know a deer isn't already bedding in, because it's not really likely that it's going to walk over, a multiple trunk tree that's horizontally strewn. They're probably going to dodge it. Now, I've seen mature bucks do pretty much everything that you wouldn't imagine them to do. I've seen them for some reason walk straight through that when other deer didn't. And I know there's a reason to it, and it's probably to get actually downwind of me or downwind of what they suspect danger to be at. But I use blowdowns in that way, and I really do like areas like that. I think it provides an entire layer of cover, especially in hill country where you're dealing with wide open hardwoods. I think it's a great thing to one, open up the canopy and get a little bit higher stem count in there. Then even if that stem count hasn't caught back up yet and it's a really fresh blowdown, not only are you dropping a food source like fresh leaves right to the ground for those deer, but you're just giving them like natural cover. And some of my best hunts in the hills have actually been doe bedding that's revolved around blowdowns and stuff like that during the rut.
Well, you stole most of my answer, and my my answer is going to be I can think of two properties, both of which I hunted in Michigan, where tornadoes went through, localized, small ones,
Mm.
and knocked down a couple acres on a property. These were two different tornadoes, two different properties, but they basically knocked down all the trees in that area. And then exactly what you said, the first year, that's a great food source. A lot of those leaves and especially late season when they start switching to woody browse, a lot of those things that aren't accessible otherwise, especially in Michigan, because there's a pretty heavy deer population. So you got a real good browse line. So that's a food source. That's a winter food source. And then within a year or two, that canopy's open. You get all that regrowth, just like you would with clear cut logging. And then those areas quickly turn into both food source and a bedding area. So if you can find a relatively recent one where the canopy hasn't filled back in yet, those are pretty good areas.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely agree. And actually, you think of it too, depending on how scarce that food source is and what kind of tree you drop to the ground, it might be a good shed hunting destination. You think
Yeah.
about a wide open hardwood ridge and you get a couple trees falling on a south facing slope, that's open sun now coming from above. That's plenty of cover down below. And, let's say you're in, Ohio around that beltline kind of area and it's a chestnut oak, it's probably a pretty dang good place to find sheds.
What else? We don't have any more questions at this exact moment. So, what are you doing while I got you on the line, Jacob? What are you doing this time of year? Obviously, you were at Dan's workshop. Those are
Mhm.
super helpful. Maybe talk about that for a second. What you learned and how do you spend? You already mentioned repairing your relationships, right? Not that they need repair, but I'm joking.
Right.
But besides catching up with family and the workshops, how do you spend your time this time of year to maximize your success going into next year?
Yeah. So to touch on the workshops a little bit first, then I'll delve into the whole this time of year. Obviously, I guess workshops are this time of year too, but they're a great time this year. We had a really intelligent. We had 2 days of really intelligent hunters really coming in. In the first day, we had some newer hunters, and it was cool to see just kind of like a brand new perspective. Um, just some things that you may consider obvious, and just learning how, as a teacher, you need to kind of regress back and make sure you're fully explaining things. Um, just kind of how you lose that sense of where a beginner starts at. I think that's a really
Yeah.
interesting thing for myself to consider because, we are talking about thermals right away and how, we're on a marsh, but like how that edge might pull your thermal down and how that affects our setup. And they're just like, whoa, it's a thermal,
Yeah.
so it's it's interesting to think that way, but it also makes you realize that, hey, maybe in this setup I wasn't considering what a thermal is doing in the situation. So it's interesting. It's very dynamic. And then you have guys asking very high level questions, and that's driving all sorts of different conversation. So it's really great. Now, the route we ran, I've ran with Dan for a couple of years now. And so I didn't learn much more about Dan's setups, but I mostly take the opportunity while I'm there to learn from Dan's approach to teaching. And one thing that always struck me is that if one day in the workshop someone points out a fresh rub that Dan hadn't noticed, or someone points out some kind of cover, some factor, and he came up with a useful point about it, he'll integrate immediately that into his approach for the next day. So he'll just go through it. And so oftentimes he goes for the next day, he's like, I feel like today's going worse. I don't know what's going on. It's like, Dan, you're just covering everything so well now.
Yeah.
Like Dave Schwab leaned to me and he's like, dude, Dan's on fire today. And I was
Yeah.
like, yeah, he's mentioning all this stuff that everyone had questions for beforehand. And we actually had a very good group of guys that were asking good questions on top of that too. So it just really gets your mind turning, and it gets you to see how repetition can put someone in a groove, and how lack of changing can kind of cause someone not to really consider other factors and not be open to necessarily how their environment's changing. So when you see Dan evolving to these questions, and then um, just kind of learning as he goes and immediately incorporating that, it's really analogous to his hunting style, where he may come in with a certain notion and the sign and pressure is telling him something else, and he takes in that information, adapts, and then can incorporate that into his approach. I think it's something that not many guys are going to listen to right away, because they're just like hearing what he says and thinking about the setup. But when you kind of deconstruct the way his brain works, it makes a lot of sense why he's successful as a teacher and as a hunter as he goes throughout the season.
Yeah, I went to the first workshop. I think I joined the Hunting Beast. I'd have to look back. 2013, maybe. It's a long time ago.
Oh, wow, yeah.
It's been like a decade, but
Mhm.
2015 or 16. I want to say 16. I went to Dan actually put on a workshop in Michigan that year. I went to that one.
Oh, cool.
And then that same year I went to his one in Wisconsin, because he's like, "Oh, you're going to get more out of the one in Wisconsin. I'm familiar with the terrain, whatever." But the whole takeaway for me was how detail oriented he was. And at the time, I didn't even know to be looking for some of those details. So just some of the things, like to get Dan's perspective, what he's looking at, like, browse lines, and just all these little things that he was looking at. Oh, this spot, you can tell here that the grass isn't growing regularly. It's because it's a bed, right? Like it doesn't get sunlight and
Mhm.
it's matted down all the time. And how he could pick that out, like through the snow and the ice. Pretty interesting stuff. So that was real helpful for me. Like I felt like I had 80% of like what beast hunting was, but that hands-on experience. So if anyone's considering going to the workshop, hasn't been, highly recommend it. This isn't a
Yeah.
paid plug for Dan's workshop, but you learn a lot, just like you would on the job training from a trade, that a guy that's been in the trade 30 years, right? Like you're going to pick up
Yeah.
some tips and tricks that definitely work. So yeah, very helpful experience. We got another question here. It says, Pharrell says, do you review your gear this time of year, checking what worked, what didn't, and look for what solutions are available? So anything you're looking to upgrade or change out, or revisit from your gear this year, Jacob?
Yeah, Pharrell, one, shout out to you, man. He's bringing some good questions here. I
Yeah.
love it. I think I've seen him in a couple other live streams too, so appreciate you, man. But yeah, I mean, checking gear. So one thing I might do is order another pair of gum leaves. I really like mine, but I abuse the hell out of it. And I have never had something hold up as well as them, so I'm just waiting for the day they fail. I don't know if it's ever gonna come, but I'm ice fishing in them and stuff like that right now, so it's like, I'm gonna get another pair. I have the zips right now. I'm gonna get one that's not zipped, and just kind of count for me running into a landmine eventually and finding a way to ruin those. But it's that I'm checking all sorts of my camo and making sure I got everything for every situation I'm going to be in next year. And then a big thing that everyone thinks about right away is your sticks and your stand and things like that. Might be your saddle, might be your rappelling gear, things like that. Um, Tightening up all the bolts I need to. Every once in a while you're stepping on a step and it's making a little creak. Getting some last second stealth strips on anything that I noticed was just a little bit cumbersome or a little bit loud this last season. And then I always had the stealth strips that I put on the cables, they eventually wear on me because I'm just fidgety and I rub my boots on them all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm always working with that. And then one big thing with any stand that you run and most sticks is actually waxing up your grommets and your any of your like kind of squeaky contact points. They flow smoother, they make less sound. You could have something that's silent for 5 years, but eventually as you're working that stand in, things are getting tighter, things are getting looser. It could end up making a creak sound. So just working that in like a bowstring really, and just making sure it stays conditioned is huge to me. And then I'm gonna do quite a bit of renovation on my bow this off season. I had to completely replace the cables and strings. I'm gonna
Same.
work on my cam timing and stuff like that. So that's gonna be a big thing on my docket. And that's actually that's a perfect segue from the last question too, was that just going through gear and to me, I take the small respite just enough to drive myself insane, then I'm not out scouting. And this is kind of going to be the gear side of it. And then once that snow and ice is a little bit gone, so I can see more sign, I'm right back into the scouting game.
Similar items for me. The one thing you didn't mention, I am getting new strings and cables. I do that as needed. I think I'm on 2 years on the set. I don't shoot crazy amount. I had a shoulder surgery a couple of years ago, so I don't shoot year round, mostly because I don't want to wear that thing out anymore. But I usually start shooting in like April, so I'm getting plenty of reps in, just not all year. So now's a good time for me to change that. Then two things that I'm changing, both related to my many bull elk woes this year. First one, rangefinder. That's the biggest one. So I had a Vortex, and I'm not throwing them under the bus. It worked well in certain situations.
A
And
Vortex right now
yeah,
for my
yeah,
internship with them.
yeah. Well, you can tell them
That's-
they're Vortex Ranger 1800. I'm not a fan, and it could be my fault. Let me start out by saying the part. Any rangefinder, you got your ocular lens, and then below that you got the lens that covers the laser. My laser is absolutely, the coatings on that are mangled because I do a lot of spot and stock. I crawl around, and I've always got my rangefinder. I don't know if we can see, but I've always got it on the side of my binocular harness, and I do a lot of belly crawling for antelope and stuff. So, anyways, that's beat up. But several times this year, I was getting really weird ranges, and they don't work well. That one specifically in grass. So I switched to Leopold and TBD on this. We'll see how this one works out. But it's called the Full Draw 5, and it's got a feature that's supposed to help it through obstacles and fog and stuff. So we'll see. I know the one I was using doesn't work, or doesn't work how I want it to, and so it can't be any worse. So hopefully that's good.
I've
And then,
heard good things about the one you're talking about too. So
yeah, and it's got a couple cool features that are bow hunting specific. You can chronograph your bow, input your speed, and then it'll give you a maximum height trajectory.
oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
remember
so
hearing about that.
it'll give you, your regular crosshair, but then it'll give you a dashed line at the peak of your arrow flight, so halfway the arc for, I don't know if you got branches in the way or whatever, like you're shooting 40, 50 yards, you get a pretty good arc going. So that's helpful. And there was one other thing I can't think of right off the top of my head. Anyways, it's got some cool features that are specific to bow hunting, and it's still got like a 900-yard game range. So I'm never shooting that farther than that with a rifle, right? So it's a good all-around hunting rangefinder. And then the other thing I'm changing is my sight. So we should have a conversation. I'd like to know what you're shooting for a sight. I'm a big believer in fixed pin sights for hunting. A lot of guys shoot a single pin mover. I'm not a fan. I've heard so many stories of, oh, I missed this buck because my mover was on 40 and it came in at 20 and I forgot to rebaseline my mover or whatever. So I've always shot a fixed pin sight. But out west, you get longer opportunities if you're practiced and you're willing to take them, where you might be shooting 50 yards, 60 yards, 70 yards. And at those distances, I'd say 45 and beyond, having a pin that you can move is really important to me because I want to shoot an exact range, right? If I range 47, I want to pin on 47 if I can. So I don't know if you've heard of them, but there's a company called Option Archery, and they've got a really cool, Dan Evans is the guy that owns it. And he actually, if you ever heard of Trophy Taker, Dan Evans is the name behind Trophy Taker. He sold that company. I think he had a non-compete for a few years, and now he's making his own sights again, and it's called Option Archery. Anyways, they've got two, like when you look through the sight ring, it's actually split in two vertically, and it's got magnets. On one plane, your first one that doesn't flip open, you've got your mover pin. So you can move that up and down. And then in front of that, you can get it in a bunch of configurations, but I'll probably get a 5-pin. So you'd have 4 pins on the front that are fixed that you can actually flip out of the way. So if you want the single pin, you can flip the front open, it magnets open. And then if you want to, let's say you're elk hunting, they move around fast, they come charging in. If you want the fixed pin setup, you just leave it closed. And then you've got the best of both worlds. So I'm going to pick one of those up. If anybody wants to look at those, fair warning, they're not cheap. But interesting concept, and I'm looking forward to trying that out. What do you run for a sight?
That really sounds great. Yeah, I run I'm pretty sure it's a black gold. It's a 5-pin fixed sight.
Okay.
5 fixed pin sight. And I shoot at 20, 40, 50, 60. Yeah, right. 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. There we go.
Yeah.
And I got a 540 grain setup. I think we talked about at least the arrow setup one time before on here. And that gives me a bit of a pin gap. And so I can differentiate between those. I practice a lot at each of those ranges. So I've never had an issue of mixing up the pins. Maybe it'll happen someday. I kind of doubt it from how much I practice, but I'm never going to say that anyone that's made that mistake is being foolish. I won't say I'm omit to mistakes, but at the same time, I like having that pin gap because it's very easy to differentiate between the pins and I can see my target between them. But when I go out west, I might be switching to a little bit lighter of an arrow setup after talking to Ethan Eskew and experiencing what I did in Nebraska this year. I just realized that it's much harder to judge range when you can't see the ground. That's something that Christopher Leppert talked about quite a bit. When the cover is about belly of the deer high at the very minimum, and you've got wisps that are going about your own head height, which are like those standing sunflowers, that makes it very, very difficult to judge range no matter how many times you practice in a yard doing it or in a stand or on any kind of elevation. So that's something I'm going to work on actually quite a bit is probably doing some partner shoots where we have someone adjust the range in an actual field and then throwing a backstop behind that target in case, I was thinking like a curtain with a rug or something like that, so that I can stop that arrow if I misjudge range again, but at least get some practice with things like that. And then on top of it, probably just a little bit lighter of an arrow setup. While I do absolutely love my setup, I think it would make a difference when you're misjudging 5 yards to be either missing the deer or 2 inches high. I think it makes a big difference. And I would kind of at this point rather be 2 inches high from the way I've been failing recently and always over judging the range.
Yeah, that's a real thing coming from the Midwest, judging distance in the plains, like antelope specifically, or anywhere. I mean, Nebraska, that's a good example where you're hunting whitetails and you don't have a ton of what I call like hard landmarks, like trees, things that you're used to in a normal Midwest deer hunting environment. It's tough, and I've had my share of missed opportunities because of misjudged range, be it the rangefinder or not having time to range. That happens quite a bit too, where if you're stalking in on something, okay, it gets up and it moves 10 yards and either you're already at full draw or you don't have time to range and draw. So that's a real thing. What you said 540, Ethan give you any advice? I'm curious where you're going to be heading with your overall arrow weight.
I'm not sure. I'm going to talk to him more about it specifically, but it was funny. I was on a long drive to Nebraska, and Ethan and I hadn't talked over the phone. We'd messaged and stuff quite a few times. And he was like, yeah, I'm headed to Colorado right now. and I was like, "I'm headed to Nebraska," and at, like, the same time we texted, "Hey, you wanna talk deer?" Like, just
Yeah,
we
yeah,
hopped on a phone call for, like, 5 hours straight, until I think he had to stop and get some sleep. But, it was a really good way to pass the time, and we ended up discussing it and basically gave me the impression that I, was in for some challenges, on the way to Nebraska, so it was already too late this year.
yeah.
Um, I'd have to pick his mind a little bit more about his total arrow weight, but I'm leaning something in the low 400s, maybe around 400. Um, but yeah, I know he's got his setups absolutely dialed. He's a fantastic archer, and, I know he's very confident in what he does, and it certainly shows, and he doesn't fail very often. He's certainly had a lot of success this year, so,
Yeah, he's
I'm
legit
gonna take
for
his
sure.
word for it. Oh, dude, he is. He's a really great guy too. I mean, there's lots of guys that kill good deer, and I, I don't they kill a lot of really good deer, but I don't necessarily respect them as much as a person, if I can put it as kindly as possible.
Sure.
And the guys I really enjoy talking to, and the people I really like to follow, are the ones that are good husbands, boyfriends, fathers as well. And Ethan is just a good person in general, and I'm happy to consider him one of my friends. So um, I'd be very willing to take his advice on anything, whether it be inside of hunting or out. So
Yeah, on the arrow weight setup, and I don't know him well, but the guy that runs the local archery shop in Billings, his name is Rob Morgan, and
okay, yeah.
if you've ever heard the name, it's because he's been a Hoyt pro shooter for a while.
Oh,
His son is Tate Morgan, and Tate Morgan, as far as I still know, unless something's changed, his girlfriend or fiance, wife now maybe, is Paige Pierce. So if she's a professional archer, Tate's a professional, Rob's a professional.
wow,
I'm saying all this to say that Rob shoots like a 440 grain arrow for elk, right? So
wow,
he's not in the heavy arrow craze, but he does
yeah,
shoot a fixed two blade broadhead, right?
cutting
So he shoots
contact kind of
a
thing.
reasonable broadhead for that setup. He's not shooting a 2.3-inch rage expandable, at an elk with a 400 grain arrow. So, but
Yeah,
for all the reasons you mentioned, you got a lot more room for error when you're shooting 40 yards plus when you got a 400 grain arrow versus a 500 plus.
yeah, yeah, and I shoot those G5 Montecs. I shot them for a very long time, and I really like them. I mean, you saw the result of the Wisconsin deer this year, the Nebraska. I mean, every deer I killed this year actually died in sight of where I shot it. So it, w- I love, same thing with the two blade cut on contact. I just really love cut on contact tips, and I think that just that momentum being carried forward, you could have a much lighter setup too, and it would be pretty damn effective.
Yeah, let's do one more question here, and then I think we're gonna wrap it up. I want to say, hey, thanks for
Sure.
jumping on. I wanted
Yeah.
someone brave to come on and test the setup to make sure I could get somebody on the live. So if anybody's watching this, that's gonna watch Dan's channel. The plan is, we'll see if it works in execution. Is anybody that wants to come on, they'll get into a queue, and then like just for example, let's say there was 10 people behind Jacob. We could have Jacob on for a question or two. He'll leave, and then we'll pull the next person in. So that's why I'm testing this out, and that's the plan going forward for Dan's live. And I might do a couple more of these. It's been kind of fun. But
Cool.
we got another question from Pharrell. Pharrell, thanks for all the questions tonight. Appreciate it. He said, and this is for you, Jacob. Do you see similar teaching adaptations going back to what you were talking about, Dan, and being a teacher for wrestling and jujitsu? He must know that you were a
Oh,
wrestler.
yeah, I like that. Um, I certainly do, and it's from higher level coaches, really. So I wrestled at Askren Wrestling Academy. Ben Askren,
Oh yeah, the man.
Funky Askren, he
Yeah,
developed an entire style of wrestling essentially, and yeah, he was fantastic, and I could go on for an hour about how great his teaching style was. But one of his main mentors, or mentees, is Keegan O'Toole, and I wrestled with Keegan all throughout growing up. I was actually there the first day he ever came to AWA, and saw him turn in from this little kid into now the two-time NCAA champ that he is, going for his third right now,
nice.
trying to make it four in as many years. And I truly believe that he'll do it if not for another guy in our club maybe taking it from him. So Ben, who developed an entire style of wrestling, has learned moves from Keegan and openly admitted it in practice. I think another aspect of that is not having a big ego and being willing to admit that you learned something from someone. And he'll have Keegan run practices. he'll go through moves with Keegan to try and see how he feels in those positions and things like that. And it's the same thing in jujitsu as well. It's just learning and adapting to the situation you're in. Obviously, while you're on the fly in practice is huge, and just learning from the person that is competing against you and saying, "Hey, like, what did you do there? How did you defend that? I felt like I was going to score there. It didn't happen. Like, what read was I giving you?" And it's kind of like that in hunting too. Is just obviously you can't go ask the deer, "Hey, what did you see there? Why did I screw up? Why aren't you dead?"
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
but you can trace back those situations. I think a really good point Dan made this weekend is when he kills a deer, every single time, whether it's in the spring or next fall or something like that, he goes back and traces back that deer steps and figure out what it was actually doing. So there's no misconceptions about, you know, was the deer actually bedded there? Was it actually cruising? Like what was really going on? And I think that's just a fantastic way to learn is anytime you can take a real encounter and extract every piece of information possible and break it down, it's excellent. And I think that's why he's just so successful. And everyone else that really does that is successful is they're not too egotistical to learn from anyone. They're always trying to gather more information. And when they do succeed or fail, they find out why.
Yeah, and the wrestling, jujitsu, you name it, any hobby, sport, the game's
Yeah.
always changing, always evolving. There's always going to be something new, and even, I mean, not that new things are always better, but they might be, and it's worth looking at, and it's worth listening to people, especially if they're having success, like Keegan or Dan or young guys, right? Like you're a younger guy coming up and having success. So Ethan, great example there too, young guy
Right.
having tons of success. Like I'm getting old. I listen to you guys. I'm not. I don't think I know it all, right?
Yeah.
There's lots to learn still. So good tips
Yeah.
there. Let's see. I think that's it. Jacob, hey, thanks for jumping on. We'll have to maybe do this again. I'll try to give you more than 5 minutes warning next time and not catch you at bedtime, but appreciate
Oh,
it.
no.
And, I think this made things go a lot better and got to test out the features here. So we'll be watching the last thing before we jump off. We'll go ahead and plug where can people find you if they don't already know you. They probably do, but plug it anyways.
Well, thank you, man.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was glad to be the guinea pig in any situation, and this one's at least beneficial to both of us. I mean,
sure.
that show you've been doing with Dan has been excellent, and obviously, always a big fan of you and a big fan of Dan. So great to see you guys doing that. But yeah, you can check out my stuff on YouTube at the Wild Calling, making videos for the Hunting Beast here and there too. So anything on the Hunting Beast, everything that you're doing with the podcast that is supporting me and the people I love in this industry, and then obviously you can check out my channel too and some of the hunts on there at the Wild Calling.
And I think I saw a post real recently, got some t-shirts too. So if you're looking for some
Yeah.
wild calling swag, get them while they're hot.
Thanks, man. Hey, you were spot on with the sizing too. Appreciate the recommendation there.
Oh yeah, no problem. All right. Well, have a good one and we'll catch everybody next time. Thanks.